Hello, and welcome back. Tonight, we are going somewhere dark. Not the kind of dark that comes from a frightening story or a villain with a name you can point to. This is a different kind of dark entirely. The kind that descends on a city slowly, quietly, house by house, street by street, until one morning the bells will not stop ringing, and there is no one to ask why. Tonight, we are going to follow the Black Death. Almost everyone has heard those two words. Most people know in a loose and distant way that it was a plague, that it killed an enormous number of people, that it happened somewhere in medieval Europe a very long time ago. But very few people know what it actually felt like to live through it, what the cities smelled like in those years, what a mother said to her children when the swellings appeared, what a priest wrote in his diary when he ran out of prayers, what a merchant thought when his entire street fell silent in the space of a single week. And the answer, when you follow it closely enough, is something far more human, far more heartbreaking, and honestly, far more strange than any legend has ever managed to capture. So, get comfortable. Let the room go quiet around you. There is nowhere you need to be for the next little while except right here, drifting back 7 centuries into a world that is about to be turned completely upside down. The story begins not in Europe at all, but somewhere much further east on the vast open grasslands of Central Asia, where something small and invisible was already moving, and it was moving fast.
Before the Black Death, there was a world. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is easy to think of the plague as the beginning of the story. It was not. It was an interruption of a story already well underway, and the world it interrupted was, in its own complicated way, a world of some energy and some hope. The Europe of the early 1300s was crowded, not crowded in the way our modern cities are crowded, but crowded by the standards of a continent that had been steadily filling up for 3 centuries. The population had grown dramatically since the year 1000, driven by improvements in farming, by the clearing of forests, by a run of unusually warm and productive weather that historians sometimes call the medieval warm period. Villages that had once held 50 families now held 200. Towns had grown into cities. Cities had grown into something approaching the idea of a civilization with architecture to match. The great cathedrals of France and England were going up during this period, stone by slow stone, projects that would take generations to complete, and that expressed, in the most visible possible way, a confidence that the future was worth building for. The people who lived in this world dressed according to their station, as they always had. The nobility wore fine wools and silks, trimmed with fur at the edges, in colors that ordinary people were sometimes legally forbidden to imitate. The clergy moved through the streets in their habits and robes, black for the Dominicans, white and brown for the Franciscans, marking themselves as men and women apart from the general traffic of daily life. The common people, the farmers and craftsmen and servants who made up the vast majority of the population, wore rough linen and undyed wool, simple and practical and built to last. The towns smelled of animals and wood smoke, and the particular sharpness of open drains running along the center of unpaved streets. The markets were noisy and dense, piled with cloth and grain and spices and live chickens and arguments about price. The taverns were full in the evenings, with men who had finished their work and had nowhere else to go. The churches were full in the mornings, and the prayers said they were sincere. Because in a world where medicine could do very little against most serious illness, and where a bad harvest could mean genuine starvation, The distance between a person and catastrophe was not very large, and most people knew it. But beneath this surface of ordinary activity, the continent was already under stress in ways that made it vulnerable. The warm period that had sustained 3 centuries of growth was ending. Beginning in the early 1300s, the climate began to shift. The summers grew shorter and wetter. The harvests began to fail. Between 1315 and 1322, a catastrophic sequence of wet summers and cold winters produced what historians call the Great Famine, a sustained collapse of food production across northern Europe that killed millions of people directly and left the survivors weakened in ways that would not fully heal before the next disaster arrived. The bodies of the people who were alive in 1347 were not the bodies of a well fed and resilient population. They were, in many cases, the bodies of people who had already survived one catastrophe and were carrying the marks of it. Malnourishment weakens the immune system in ways that are not always visible from the outside. A person can look reasonably well and still be far less capable of fighting off infection than they should be. Europe, in the middle of the 14th century, was a continent full of people who looked functional and were, in a real physiological sense, already compromised. Into this world, something was coming. It had been moving for years before anyone in Europe knew it existed. The origins of the Black Death are one of the most studied questions in the history of medicine, and the short answer is that we now know, with reasonable certainty, where it came from, even if the people who lived through it had absolutely no idea. The disease was caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. It lived, and still lives, in the bodies of rodents, particularly the large ground squirrels and other small mammals of the Central Asian steppe, the vast grassland that stretches from China in the east across what is now Kazakhstan and into the fringes of Eastern Europe. In those animal populations, the disease had probably been present for centuries, circulating quietly in a kind of ecological balance that harmed the rodents but did not generally threaten anything else. What disturbed that balance in the 1330s and 1340s is not entirely clear. Climate fluctuations may have stressed the rodent populations, pushing infected animals into new territory or into closer contact with human settlements. Trade routes across Central Asia had become unusually active during this period under the relative stability of the Mongol Empire, which controlled an enormous stretch of Eurasian territory and had opened the great overland routes between China and the Mediterranean to a degree of commercial traffic that the region had rarely seen before. Whatever the combination of triggers, the disease began moving westward along the trade routes sometime in the 1340s, carried in the bodies of fleas that lived on rats, which traveled in the cargoes of merchant caravans, which moved from city to city with the unstoppable logic of commerce. In 1346, there were reports from the eastern shore of the Black Sea of a catastrophic epidemic killing enormous numbers of people in the cities of the Mongol Khanate. The Italian merchant colonies at Kaffa, a trading port in what is now Crimea, found themselves inside a city under siege from both a Mongol army outside the walls and a disease that was killing people inside them at a pace that nobody had ever witnessed. There is a story, reported by one Italian chronicler, that the Mongol forces besieging Kaffa catapulted the bodies of their plague dead over the walls into the city, in what might be the earliest recorded instance of biological warfare. Whether this happened exactly as described, historians debate. What is not debated is that when the Italian merchants of Kaffa finally managed to board their ships and flee westward across the Black Sea and through the Mediterranean, they were carrying the disease with them. In October of 1347, a fleet of Genoese ships docked at the port of Messina in Sicily. By the time the harbor authorities arrived to inspect the cargo, most of the sailors aboard the ships were dead. The ones who were still alive were covered in black swellings, oozing blood and pus from their necks and armpits and groins. The authorities of Messina did what any sensible port authority would do. They ordered the ships to leave immediately. It was already too late. The disease was on the docks. The disease was in the city. And from Messina, it would never stop moving until it had traveled the length and breadth of a continent. To understand what happened next, it helps to understand the biology of what the Black Death actually did to a human body, because the medicine of the 14th century had no idea, and the horror of the disease was compounded enormously by the fact that nobody watching it could make any sense of it at all. The bacterium Yersinia pestis traveled most commonly in the bite of a flea. A flea that had fed on an infected rodent would take the bacteria into its digestive system, where they would multiply until they blocked the flea's stomach entirely. Unable to feed properly, the flea would bite again and again in a kind of frantic hunger, and each time it bit, it would regurgitate a small amount of bacteria laden material into the wound. This was the mechanism of transmission: invisible, silent, requiring nothing more dramatic than the ordinary presence of rats and the fleas that lived on them, which in a 14th century city was simply a description of the background. Once inside a human body, the bacteria traveled through the lymphatic system to the nearest lymph node, where the immune system would mount its defense and, almost always, fail. The lymph node would swell as the bacteria multiplied faster than the body could contain them, producing the characteristic dark, painful swellings that gave the disease its name: buboes. The word comes from the Greek for groin, because that was one of the most common sites where the swellings appeared, though they formed equally in the armpits and at the sides of the neck, wherever the lymph nodes clustered near the surface of the skin. The swellings could grow to the size of an egg or larger. They were hard and hot to the touch and exquisitely painful. The fever that accompanied them was high and relentless. The sufferer became delirious. They could not eat, could not sleep, could not find a position that offered any relief from the pain. In many cases, the bacteria would spread from the lymph nodes into the bloodstream, causing what was called septicemic plague, where the infection moved through the body so rapidly that the small blood vessels under the skin would rupture, producing the dark blotches and discoloration that gave the disease its common name. In the worst cases, the extremities would begin to die, fingers and toes going black as the blood supply failed while the person was still alive. A third form of the disease, pneumonic plague, spread directly from person to person through the air. When the bacteria reached the lungs and infected coughs and breath carried the infection across a room. This form killed even faster than the others and was even harder to contain because it required no flea, no rat, nothing but the ordinary act of breathing in the presence of someone already sick. Death came, in most untreated cases, within 3 to 5 days of the first symptoms. 3 to 5 days. This is a detail that deserves to sit still for a moment. A person could wake up on a Monday morning feeling perfectly well and be dead by Thursday. They might notice the first swelling on Tuesday and be feverish and delirious by Wednesday evening. By Friday, their household would be wondering whether to flee or stay, and by the following week, several of them would be following the same path. The speed was part of what made it so terrifying. In a world where sickness was common and chronic illness was a normal feature of life, people had a certain learned resilience around gradual decline. They understood, at some emotional level, how to pace themselves against the slowness of ordinary death. The Black Death offered no such accommodation. It moved like nothing anyone had seen before, and it killed at a rate that the imagination simply refused to process. From Sicily, the disease moved in two directions simultaneously: westward along the Mediterranean coast and northward into Italy. Italy in 1348 was not a single country, but a collection of city-states, some of the wealthiest and most densely populated places in Europe. Florence, Venice, Genoa, Milan, cities that had grown prosperous on trade and banking and the textile industry. Cities packed tightly within their walls with populations that would have astonished anyone who had seen them a century earlier. Dense population, active trade, constant movement of goods and people. These were exactly the conditions in which a disease carried by fleas on rats would move with maximum efficiency. Venice lost perhaps 60% of its population in 18 months. Florence, the city of Dante and Giotto, the city that considered itself the most civilized place in the world, lost somewhere between half and two-thirds of its people in a single year. The Florentine writer Giovanni Boccaccio lived through the plague in his city and described it in the introduction to his famous collection of stories, the Decameron, written in the years immediately following. His account is one of the most remarkable documents the epidemic produced, not because it is heroic or uplifting, but because it is honest, in a way that the official chronicles of the period rarely were, about what actually happened to human behavior when death arrived at this scale and this speed. He described the swellings and their appearance. He described how quickly the sick died. He described how the healthy fled from the sick, how neighbors refused to help neighbors, how family members left their own relatives to die alone, how the ordinary systems of care and burial that society maintained collapsed under the weight of sheer numbers. He also described something else, something that appears in account after account from the plague years, a kind of manic abandonment that seized some portion of the surviving population. People who had decided, consciously or not, that if death was this close and this random, then the ordinary rules of life no longer applied. They spent their days drinking and dancing. They moved from house to house. They took what they wanted. They behaved, in other words, as people behave when they have concluded that tomorrow is not guaranteed and the consequences of today no longer matter. This is not a comfortable thing to read about, and Boccaccio did not intend it to be comfortable. He was documenting the dissolution of a social order that had taken centuries to build, happening in the space of months. The physicians of the 14th century watched all of this with a combination of horror and professional confusion that their training had not remotely prepared them for. The medical education of the period was built on the theories of the ancient Greek physician Galen, whose authority had not been seriously questioned in 1,000 years. Disease, in this framework, was caused by imbalances in the four bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and the appropriate treatment was to restore balance through bleeding, purging, and the administration of elaborate herbal preparations. None of this had any effect whatsoever on Yersinia pestis. The physicians bled their patients, and the patients died. They prescribed their preparations, and the patients died. They consulted their astrological charts and determined that the catastrophe had been caused by the conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the sign of Aquarius in 1345, which was a precise and learned explanation of something they had no power to prevent, and the patients died. Some physicians stayed. Many fled. The ones who stayed were brave, in a way that deserves acknowledgement, because they were walking into houses full of death, with no protection, no understanding of what they were dealing with, and no real ability to help anyone. When medicine fails, people reach for other explanations, and the 14th century had a full range of them available. The most immediate and most theologically satisfying explanation was divine punishment. God was angry. This was not a fringe interpretation held by frightened peasants. It was the considered view of the most educated men in the church and the universities. The plague was a judgment, sent because of human sinfulness, and the appropriate response was repentance. This belief produced one of the most extraordinary and disturbing movements of the entire plague period, a group of people known as the Flagellants. The flagellants appeared first in Central Europe in 1348 and spread rapidly through Germany, the Low Countries, and parts of France and beyond. They traveled in organized groups of sometimes hundreds of people, moving from town to town, performing a ritual of public penance that was intended to appease the divine anger that had sent the plague. The ritual was what the name suggests. They flogged themselves. Twice a day, in the public squares of the towns they entered, they would form a circle and beat themselves across the back with leather straps tipped with metal spikes until the blood ran freely down their backs and onto the stones beneath their feet. They did this while singing hymns. They did this for 33 and a half days, one day for each year of Christ's life. They did this while crowds gathered to watch, some of them weeping, some of them joining the procession, drawn by the conviction that in a time of incomprehensible suffering, this was the most honest possible response. The Church, after some initial uncertainty, condemned the flagellants as heretical. The Pope issued a bull against them in 1349. They were suppressed, eventually, by a combination of ecclesiastical pressure and the simple exhaustion of the movement. But for a period of several years, they moved through the towns of Central Europe as a walking expression of what it felt like to be alive in a world that had stopped making sense. The other response to the need for an explanation was darker and more violent. Somebody had to be responsible. In the reasoning of fear and grief, a disaster this large could not simply be random. It had to have a cause that could be identified, a source that could be blamed, and if possible, punished. In town after town across Germany, France, and Switzerland, the Jewish population was accused of poisoning the wells. There was no evidence for this. There could not have been, because it was not true. The disease was caused by a bacterium carried by fleas on rats, and the wells had nothing to do with it. But evidence was not what the situation required. What it required was a target for a grief that had no legitimate place to go. The massacres of Jewish communities during the plague years were widespread and systematic. In Strasbourg, 2,000 Jewish people were burned alive in their cemetery in February of 1349, before the plague had even fully arrived in the city, as a prophylactic measure, as if the killing could prevent what was coming. In Mainz, the Jewish community fought back and killed 200 of the attackers before they were overwhelmed. In Basel, the community was locked into a wooden building and burned. Pope Clement VI issued two papal bulls explicitly stating that the Jews were not responsible for the plague and ordering that they be protected. The orders were largely ignored. The logic of scapegoating is not responsive to evidence, particularly not when the people issuing the evidence are far away and the grief and terror are immediate and present. This is one of the aspects of the plague years that is hardest to sit with. Not the dying, which was terrible, but the choice that many of the living made about what to do with their terror. It is a choice that appears in different forms in almost every major catastrophe in human history. And the 14th century version of it was among the most lethal. The plague did not confine itself to cities. It moved into the countryside with the same efficiency, traveling along roads and rivers, following the routes that connected village to village and market to farm. The experience of the plague in a small rural village was different from its experience in a city, but not necessarily less devastating. A village of 200 people that lost half its population had lost something that a city, with its reserves of people and resources, might eventually replace. A village did not replace it. What was left was a settlement with empty houses, fields that nobody had planted, animals that had wandered away from broken fences, and a silence that would have been incomprehensible to the same village 5 years earlier. There are villages in England that disappeared from the historical record during the plague years. Not destroyed by violence, not burned, simply emptied by disease and never refilled. The fields grew over. The streets became paths, and the paths became grass. Today, in certain parts of the English countryside, you can find slight depressions in the ground, traces of foundations and lanes, and the outlines of long vanished buildings. And what you are looking at, if you know where to look, is the ghost of a village that the plague killed. The farming economy of medieval Europe was built on a system of labor that had very little slack in it. Crops needed to be planted at a specific time and harvested at a specific time, and both operations required a specific number of people working at a specific pace. When a quarter or a third or half of the workforce died in the space of a few months, the fields did not wait for the survivors to recover their footing. The harvest rotted in the fields. The livestock went unattended. The careful maintenance of soil and drainage that had made the farmland productive was simply not done because there was nobody left to do it. The agricultural crisis that followed the plague compounded its immediate mortality in ways that stretched the disaster out over years. People who survived the disease sometimes died of its consequences, of hunger, and of the secondary infections that follow malnutrition in the years after the worst of the killing was over. The monasteries deserve particular mention here because they suffered disproportionately. The monastic communities of medieval Europe were places of communal life, of shared meals and shared dormitories and constant proximity. And they were places where the sick were brought, because the monks and nuns had some of the most reliable medical knowledge available and a religious obligation to provide care. These conditions were ideal for the spread of an airborne infection like pneumonic plague. Monastery after monastery lost the majority of its community. Some were completely wiped out. The institutional knowledge stored in those communities, the manuscripts they had copied and preserved, the medical and agricultural expertise accumulated over generations was lost along with the people who carried it. In some parts of England, it is estimated that nearly half of the ordained clergy died during the plague years. The church responded by ordaining replacements as quickly as possible, which meant that a significant portion of the clergy of the 1350s had been in orders for a very short time and had received a very abbreviated education. The long term effects on the quality of pastoral care and religious instruction were real and lasted decades. At some point in telling this story, the numbers have to be faced because they are the fact around which everything else orbits, and they are still, even after all these centuries, genuinely difficult to absorb. The Black Death killed somewhere between 75 million and 200 million people. The range is wide because the records are incomplete and because the disease struck a world that did not yet have the administrative machinery to count its own dead with any precision. The best modern estimates suggest that Europe lost somewhere between 30 and 60% of its total population in the years between 1347 and 1351. 30 to 60% in 4 years. To translate that into something more immediate, if a town had 1,000 people in 1346, it might have between 400 and 700 people in 1352. Every family in that town had lost someone. Most had lost several people. Some had been entirely erased. The psychological effect of this scale of loss is something that the records can gesture at but cannot fully capture, because the inner life of medieval people was not something they wrote about freely. What we have are the things they built and the things they said in public documents and the choices they made in the years following the plague. And from those, we can infer something about what the experience had done to the way they understood the world. What it seems to have done, among other things, is fundamentally alter the relationship between the living and death. Before the plague, death was certainly present in medieval life, present in a way that modern Western society has largely succeeded in managing out of daily experience. People died of illness and accident and violence at ages that would seem shocking to us, and they did so in their homes, surrounded by family, not in institutions. Death was not hidden, but it was still, in most cases, the death of an individual or a family or at most a community in a local epidemic. It was death at a human scale. After the plague, death had been experienced at a scale that was not human. It had been cosmic. It had filled the streets and the fields and the monasteries and the halls of the nobility and the hovels of the peasants without any observable principle of selection. The good died alongside the wicked. The devout died alongside the sinful. The young died as readily as the old. Children died. Infants died. None of the categories that people used to organize their sense of fairness and meaning had offered any protection. The art produced in the decades after the plague reflects this. The image of the dance macabre, the dance of death, in which skeletons lead figures from every rank of society in a procession toward the grave, became one of the defining images of the late 14th and 15th centuries. It appeared on the walls of churches, in the margins of manuscripts, on tapestries and panels. The message was consistent and unmistakable. Death comes for the king and the beggar alike. Death comes regardless of what you have done or what you deserve. Death comes, and you will dance with it, whether you choose to or not. This is not a comfortable image to put on a church wall, but it is an honest one for people who had just spent 4 years watching it happen. The plague did not simply kill people and leave everything else unchanged. It restructured the society that survived it in ways that took decades to become fully visible, but that shaped the course of European history for centuries. The most immediate and dramatic change was economic. When a third to a half of the population dies in 4 years, The relationship between labor and land is fundamentally altered. Before the plague, Europe had more workers than work, in a sense. The population had grown faster than the available farmland, and the result was a large population of landless laborers competing for wages that stayed low because the supply of workers always exceeded the demand. Landlords held all the power in this equation. A peasant who objected to his conditions could be replaced without difficulty. After the plague, the equation reversed. Suddenly, there were more farms than farmers, more work than workers. Landlords who needed their fields plowed and their harvests brought in found that the surviving laborers could demand better wages, better conditions, better terms. Some simply walked away from their old manners and moved to where the terms were more favorable, something that the old system had made nearly impossible, and the new arithmetic of labor scarcity made perfectly practical. The response of the nobility and the landholding class was to try to legislate the old order back into existence. In England, the Statute of Laborers of 1351 attempted to freeze wages at pre plague levels and forbid workers from moving to better paying employment. In France, similar measures were tried. They failed. You cannot legislate against arithmetic. When there are fewer workers than jobs, the workers will find a way to capture some of that advantage regardless of what the laws say, because the people with jobs to fill need them too desperately to hold the line. The result, playing out slowly over the decades following the plague, was a gradual improvement in the condition of the peasant and laboring classes of Western Europe. Not immediately, not without resistance and violence. The Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381, the French Jacquerie in 1358. These were expressions of the new tension between a peasant class that had tasted the power of its own scarcity and a nobility that had not yet fully accepted what the plague had done to the old arrangements. But the direction of change was set by the demographics, and the demographics did not lie. The church emerged from the plague years significantly weakened in ways that are harder to quantify, but perhaps more important in the long run. An institution that had presented itself as the mediator between God and humanity, that had promised that righteous living and sincere repentance and the proper performance of the sacraments would secure divine protection, had watched those promises fail at scale. The righteous had died alongside the wicked. The prayers had not been answered. The sacraments had been performed, and the plague had come anyway. This did not destroy faith. Medieval Europeans did not stop being Christians because the plague killed them. But it introduced a skepticism, a willingness to question the church's authority and the adequacy of its explanations that would take a century and a half to fully mature and would eventually produce the Reformation. The connection between the experience of the Black Death and the eventual fracturing of the church's monopoly on Christian thought is not direct or simple, but it is real. A generation that had seen God's supposed representatives fail comprehensively was a generation slightly less inclined to simply accept what those representatives told it. The plague also accelerated certain intellectual developments that had been underway before it arrived. The sheer scale of the medical catastrophe and the complete failure of the established theories to either explain or treat it created pressure for a different approach to understanding disease. It would take another 3 centuries for germ theory to emerge, and the path between the plague of 1348 and the discoveries of Pasteur and Koch in the 19th century is long and complicated. But the repeated experience of epidemic disease in the late medieval and early modern period was one of the forces that pushed European medicine, slowly and painfully, toward observation and experimentation and away from the pure authority of ancient texts. It would be comforting to report that the Black Death of 1347 to 1351 was a single event that ended cleanly and left the survivors to rebuild in peace. It did not work that way. The plague returned. It came back in 1361 in what contemporaries called the Second Pestilence, or the Children's Plague, the latter name reflecting the observation that this wave seemed to kill children and young people at particularly high rates. Perhaps because the first wave had already killed those adults who were most susceptible, leaving a population in which the most vulnerable survivors were those who had not yet been exposed. It came back again in 1369, and again in the 1370s, and again in the 1390s. Throughout the 15th century, barely a decade passed without a significant plague outbreak somewhere in Europe. The disease became a permanent feature of the landscape, not a crisis, but a condition, something that people factored into their understanding of what life was. The great outbreaks of 1665 in London, which killed roughly 100,000 people in a single year, and of 1720 in Marseille, which killed half the city's population, were episodes in a story that had begun in the 1340s and would not fully end until the bacteriological revolution of the 19th century made it possible to understand and eventually control what had been happening. The cities most exposed to trade, the port cities, the market cities, the great commercial centers, became expert over the course of the 14th and 15th centuries at managing the disease in ways that reduced, though could never eliminate its impact. Venice, which had suffered catastrophically in the first wave, developed the practice of quarantine, requiring ships arriving from suspected plague ports to anchor offshore for a period of 40 days before their crews and cargo were allowed to land. The word quarantine comes from the Italian for 40. It was not a perfect solution, and it was not always consistently applied. But it was based on the correct observation that keeping potentially infected people separate from the healthy population reduced transmission, even though nobody in 14th century Venice understood why that was the case. The accumulation of these practical responses, imperfect and theoretically confused as they were, represents a slow and painful education in epidemic management that European societies were forced to acquire because the disease kept returning until they learned. What the numbers cannot convey, and what the broad sweep of historical analysis cannot fully capture, is the particular texture of individual experience during the plague years. The records that survive are fragmentary and uneven. The wealthy and the educated left more traces than the poor and the illiterate, which means that what we know is skewed toward those who had the leisure and the means to write things down. But within those limitations, there are voices. There is the Irish monk John Klyn, a Franciscan friar in Kilkenny, who kept a chronicle of the plague as it moved through Ireland in 1349. Near the end of the chronicle, he wrote that he was leaving parchment for continuing the work, in case any person should still be alive in the future, or any of the race of Adam should be able to escape this pestilence and carry on what he had begun. He left the parchment. Someone else finished the chronicle in a different hand with a single sentence noting that he had died. There is the English chronicler Henry Knighton, who described the aftermath of the plague in the English countryside with a precision that has the quality of genuine observation rather than rhetorical flourish. He wrote of sheep and cattle wandering the fields without anyone to tend them, of houses standing empty with no one left to inhabit them, of the difficulty of finding priests to say Mass for the dead. There are the wills, hundreds of thousands of them, from the plague years, written in haste by people who had no expectation of dying that day and were dead within the week. They are legal documents, dry in their formality, listing property and naming heirs. But read closely. They carry within them the shape of specific lives ending at specific moments. A merchant in Florence leaving his property to children he hoped would outlive him. A farmer in England leaving his land to whoever in his family was still alive to claim it. A nun in Germany leaving her few possessions to her sisters and asking that masses be said for her soul. These are ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances, and they are doing what ordinary people do, which is manage the practicalities while the world comes apart around them. There is also silence. The silence of the village records that simply stop. The silence of the monastery chronicles that end mid-sentence. The silence of the letters that were never finished, the accounts that were never settled, the children who never learned to write and so left nothing behind but their absence in the records of the living. 7 centuries later, the Black Death is still with us in ways that go beyond history. The most literal legacy is genetic. Modern research has shown that populations whose ancestors survived the Black Death carry, at higher rates than populations that were less affected, certain gene variants associated with stronger immune responses to particular kinds of bacterial infection. The survivors of the plague were, in a real biological sense, selected for resilience against that specific threat, and that selection has been passed down through the generations. There is an irony embedded in this finding that takes a moment to register. The most devastating disease in human history may have made the descendants of its survivors slightly more resistant to some diseases than they would otherwise have been. The selection pressure that killed so many people also, in the brutal logic of biology, produced a population more capable of surviving the diseases that came after. The cultural legacy is harder to measure, but equally real. The late medieval period, the century and a half between the Black Death and the beginning of the Italian Renaissance, produced art that reflects, in ways both conscious and unconscious, the experience of living in the aftermath of catastrophe. The paintings are darker, the images of death are more prominent. The human body, which in earlier medieval art had often been depicted in symbolic rather than realistic terms, began to be painted with an attention to its physical particularity and its fragility that feels like the product of people who had learned, in the hardest possible way, to look at the body honestly. The Renaissance that followed, with its extraordinary celebration of human potential and human beauty and human reason, can be read in part as a response to the century that preceded it. A civilization that had been brought to its knees chose, in the generations following the worst of the dying, to insist on the value and the possibility of the human project, to paint the body not as a vessel of disease and death, but as something capable of grace and power and beauty, to assert, against all the evidence the previous century had provided, that human beings were worth painting and studying and celebrating. It is not too much to say that the world we live in was shaped by the Black Death. The economic changes it set in motion contributed to the end of feudalism in Western Europe. The weakening of the Church's authority that it accelerated contributed to the conditions that made the Reformation possible. The pressure it placed on medical knowledge contributed, indirectly and over a very long arc, to the development of modern medicine. The very concept of quarantine, which became so familiar to people around the world in recent years, was invented in the cities of medieval Italy as a practical response to repeated epidemic. The plague did not create any of these things by itself. History does not work that simply, but it was one of the great forcing events of the human story, a pressure applied at such scale and such speed that it could not be absorbed without change, and the change it produced still runs, like an underground current, through the civilization we have inherited. The Black Death was not a metaphor. It was not a lesson. It was not, from the inside, an event with meaning or purpose or a shape that could be grasped. It was people dying, enormous numbers of people, dying quickly, in pain, often alone, in a world that could not explain what was happening to them or offer them anything more than prayers that seemed to go unanswered. That is the honest truth of it, and it deserves to be said plainly. But something else is also true, and it is worth sitting with as you drift towards sleep tonight. Every person alive today is descended from people who survived. Every human being reading or listening to this is here because somewhere in their ancestry, in the long branching chain of parents and grandparents and great grandparents stretching back through the centuries, there were people who lived through the Black Death, or through the waves of plague that followed it, or through the famines and the wars and the other catastrophes that surrounded it. Those people were not superhuman. They were not specially protected or specially deserving. They survived for reasons that included luck and biology and the particular circumstances of where they happened to live and what they happened to eat and who they happened to be near on a specific day in a specific year. But they survived, and they kept living, and they had children. And those children had children. And the long chain of survival and continuation and ordinary human persistence that connects them to you stretches across 7 centuries of history that included more darkness than anyone living in comfort today is easily able to imagine. The bells rang for an awfully long time in those years, and then, eventually, they stopped. And people went back to planting their fields and building their houses and falling in love and having arguments and making plans for a future they had no certainty they would see. Because that is what people do. That is what they have always done. And that is what you will do tomorrow when you wake up rested in a world that the survivors of the Black Death, in their endurance and their grief and their stubborn insistence on continuing, helped to make. Sleep, Uyaro. Are you still with me? If you have drifted most of the way to sleep by now, that is exactly as it should be. There is another quiet story waiting for you on the screen whenever you are ready for it. Another life, another age, another world to wander through in the dark. If tonight's journey stayed with you, a like or a subscribe means more than you might think. It helps other restless minds find their way here, to this quiet place where history waits for the end of the day. But not tonight. Tonight, let the weight of the story settle. Let your shoulders drop. Let your breathing slow. Close your eyes and let the ringing of those distant bells fade gently into silence. The plague has passed. The world is quiet. Sleep well and sweet dreams.